and it spins.
Hey y'all, tonight I'm thrilled to have Pat Lowinger back to speak about witchcraft in ancient Rome. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven.
Jefferson laid great stress on it. It wasn't enough, he said, to enshrine some rights in a constitution or a Bill of Rights. The people had to be educated, and they had to practice their skepticism and their education. Otherwise, we don't run the government. The government runs us.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us, either live or later on. We enjoy both of those. So I want to reintroduce Pat Lowinger. How have you been, Pat? Because it's been quite a hot minute since you've been on the show.
Yeah,
so I want to reintroduce. Uh-oh, I am hearing an echo. Like I'm hearing me speaking.
You were hearing
Did you hear that?
Speaking. I heard it.
That was weird. Anyway, go ahead. How have you been?
I've been good. Just, spent the first part of the summer in England doing excavation, which I do every year. Finished up the fall preparation for fall this week. So we got school starting in a couple weeks at the college. So I'll start teaching again. But for the next few weeks, I have some time off. So Wes asked me to come on. So figured I had some free time. We do it.
Well, awesome. I am so glad that you chose to come back on. I loved the last time you were on, and you actually talked about your trip going out and doing some excavating, or however you say it. I don't know if excavating is the right word, but
it is.
But yeah, and I've never forgotten about that because I was very fascinated by all of that stuff. I love history, and I just think that's fascinating. So it's pretty cool what you do.
I think it's a good job, good dodge, right? It's a good job. It gets me to do what I want. So, I'm never going to complain about my job. So best job I ever had.
All right. Well, cool. So tonight we're going to be talking about witchcraft in specifically in ancient Rome, but we're going to be having kind of a conversation about witchcraft throughout history, I guess, in a sense. So the first question that I really wanted to ask to kind of get us going is, since we're talking about Roman witches in particular, what's the difference between Greek and Roman witches?
Well, that's a really good question. It's really broad. When we look at how the Romans in their writings talking about magic, Romans tended to approach the concept of magic, and we'll define magic in a minute, but those things were outside of established religious norms. The ancient Romans were people that believed in the supernatural for the most part, believed that divine healing could occur. The gods were in various ways and shapes and forms influencing their lives. Magic is that kind of subset of belief where you or someone that's a specialist would invoke divine powers on your behalf, or you invoking them on your behalf in a more of like a one-on-one personal setting, less about like the community, so to speak, or the family, but more about many contexts, individuals. But we talk about magic in the Roman world, it's a very broad term. But we tend to think about those ritual activities that occurred in or adjacent to domestic spaces, quote unquote, the workings with divine beings in and around your home. So and that's kind of maybe the best way. And so the Greeks had a very robust tradition. And, depending on which ancient historians that you want to talk about, we have everything from where magic was widely accepted among the ancient Greeks to where among the more elites, they still thought that the Greeks practiced too many forms of magic and were too prone to superstition. The Romans did believe in magic, but they took a more socially conservative role. They thought magic was something that you had to be somewhat suspicious of because it could be used for maleficarum or evil, right? So magic's fine if it's for personal defense, for protecting you from quote unquote evil or bad events happening, but it was really a very bad social taboo to then use magic against another person. So hexings and cursings was something the Romans took very seriously. And in the Roman world, if you were guilty of witchcraft that resulted in someone's death, you could be tried for murder. And so, you'd think like, but Pat, magic's not real. But in the Roman world, they said, well, Sonny and Pat were in a feud, and we know Sonny is a practitioner of magic, and Pat died walking down that ladder. You know, my family might bring lawsuit against you and say, hey, look, Sonny is actually responsible, and you could be held for trial based on the fact that you would talk bad about me and you are a practitioner of magic, and you'd have to defend yourself. And if you're unsuccessful, you could be exiled and up to and including, you know, responsible for my death at a capital crime.
Wow.
So but the Romans were really cautious about that. And the Romans were they didn't like some of the more, and I don't want to say bizarre, but more outlandish rituals that were formed by those that were inclined to use magic. For example, many ancient people, part of the accoutrement and the, as we call them, the ritual elements, you know, what do we need? You know, I mean, I use this one in school, so I'll do it. Like, you know, we're all familiar with Eye of Newt, right? And, you know, okay, so what are the components of magical practicing? The Romans, like behind me, were nervous that witches and those that practice magic would be raiding the graves of the deceased in order to obtain different parts of the previously living in order to summon those spirits or to contact spirits or daemons that would be used for various magical activities. So the Romans were like, hey, we don't like necromancy. And necromancy wouldn't just be raising the dead. That's more of a later Christian idea. Necromancy would also anything involving contacting, binding, or using the dead for magical practices that was outside just like protective elements. So they had some anxiety over it culturally. Greeks were like, yeah, just do it, bro. It's all good. Not really, but they were much more accepting. And the Romans were much more socially conservative in that. So that's what you
mean. That has me thinking about some of the modern day witches that I've known that are kind of like the same thing. Like it's not good to use their craft against anybody else. And what doesn't, I can't remember the saying, but as long as it doesn't hurt anyone, there's a certain way that they say it. I can't remember right now, but you know, it's like just kind of trying to find a way to use the things that we have at our disposal now to try to make your life better or easier, but not to hurt other people. So that just made me think of that when you were talking about how the Romans were.
Well, and I think there would be a like modern practitioners of magic could learn a thing or two from the Romans if they wanted to go back to an ancient source, right? To try to figure out where they are. The Romans, for the general part, believed that the inclination towards magic had to do with like the fact that there were supernatural entities everywhere. There were spirits in your house, ancestral spirits that you worshipped as well. The spirits of places, gens loci. So it was a magical spiritual world, and magic was often the enticement and reciprocal patronage between both the living and these, if we call them the dead, because in some cases they were the deceased, in other cases they were, you know, we'll call them spirits of nature and places, right? So Romans did believe that, hey, you don't do this one-sided. A lot of modern practitioners, or at least a few, think that they're like a natural witch. I've heard that term a lot. The Romans would be like, really? Like it's all from you? You know, because they believed that there were supernatural forces that they had to vie with in order to gain their supernatural activities, basically to work their magic. Now, there were beliefs in the ancient world that some practitioners had more talent than others, and that certain people from certain regions of the world perhaps were more magical. You know, for example, even during the Roman times, the Romans, even after their conquest of Greece, would refer to the witches of Thessaly. The women of Thessaly is the most magically inclined. Like they were the only natural witches, but even they had to be trained by their mothers in order to be able to work this two-way mechanism. But they were the most naturally inclined towards the craft, so to speak, if we want to use that word, the craft. But you take that movie out of our frame of reference.
So when did people start believing in this magic then?
Well, magic way predates the Romans. When we look, you know, we have to actually go back into the Upper Paleolithic, We see what we could call shamanism clearly present in the archaeological record in the Mesolithic, and to complicate things, and I'm not going to do that, the Upper Paleolithic, Mesolithic, then Neolithic period, so sometime between 15,000 and roughly 12 to 10,000 BCE. That's typically where we drop the Mesolithic, and we see clear signs of shamanistic activities during the Mesolithic period and probably before. Off the top of my head, I don't want to start naming sites because I'll get it wrong and someone will fact check me and they'll go, no, Pat, that site's 12,000 BC, not 14,000 BC. But we clearly see it throughout both the Mediterranean and what will later be Europe and North Africa. We see these, and that's the area that I study, so I don't want to talk about outside those areas. But we see clear signs of ritual activity involving the supernatural that have to do with a central figure that is the person that's responsible for engaging in this activity with the other side, if you want to think that, or the spirits that are both ancestral and of place and time of those periods. So saying gods and goddesses maybe it's early at that point. We wouldn't use those terms, but we'd say, those supernatural forces that those people were interacting with and giving deference to, if you want to say patronage, ritual activity, and both to placate those deities, offering of sacrifices and such, but then segregating a certain group of people aside. These aren't priests and priestesses yet. These are people that are in the community that are set aside because of some special relationship they have with these beings or these entities, as they would have saw them.
So did people come to them and for guidance or for assistance? Did the community come to them?
Yeah, a shaman would have done everything from community relationships, like everybody comes in, we're going to bless our community. And remember, these are pretty small communities during the Mesolithic. We're not talking cities and towns. We're talking small little groups that are just pre-agrarian, by a few thousand years. So we're still engaging in a lot of hunting and gathering activity. They're coming together for blessings of the hunt, but also like the formal pronouncement of children, like, the blessing of children after they're born. Shamans probably had some activities. We think many shaman were women, by the way, or at least it was representative in those roles. We're probably acting as midwives as well. So there was a wide variety of activities that are important. Some places we see not just a single shaman, and using, if you want to say wise woman, wise man, that's fine too. But they may have been multiple of these people with slightly differential roles. Like the wise woman may have been the group seer and diviner. The wise man may have been more of like a lore keeper and someone who performed other types of ritual sacrifice. So in a community, you may have multiple people working in this role in related ways. And there was no single shaman, but a group of shaman.
Okay. All right. So I have a question really quickly. Wes asked, were there a lot of fake psychics and swindlers back then? Great question, Wes.
Well, yes. We know of purposeful duplicity. We know that people were often like, when I'm just going to use this term, the new magician came to town. It was a common point of derision to say that they were a pseudo-mantis or false wizard, and that was the chargeable crime for being a charlatan. But if you could perform and deliver, so to speak, typically you could pass through that. You'd be accepted and you get a reputation. But there was some just like today, various degrees of skepticism in the ancient world as well, regarding like, well, do you believe any person that can pluck the gizzards out of a chicken and tell you the future, or do you want someone with a reputation for being accurate? And so you even see in the ancient literature of that time that there were tensions like, hey, don't go to him, he's a quack. Go to her, she's 100% accurate. So even among those that were magical practitioners, there was this concept of reliability. Now, magic would have been outside what was typically seen with like temple cult activities as well. If you wanted, you can go down and get an oracle through a temple that had oracular connections. Not every temple did oracles, but there were those in the ancient world. Like near Rome is Cumae, right? There were places where you could go and talk to a sibyl or get but those were usually like for big groups of people, like the state. but you could go down because you couldn't afford it. So you went down to your local seer and said, hey, I need to know whether or not I should get married, or hey, is my wife cheating on me, right? Things like that. And you got an answer. Whether or not it was a good answer, that's up for you to decide.
Okay, so were the Greeks believers in witchcraft before the Romans were? Like, did it kind of go across that way, or did it kind of go at the same time?
No, both cultures kind of gain this. They both are people that believe in magic, cultural groups. Now, the Romans are descended from the native peoples of Italy. The Greeks are literate earlier than the Romans are, so we learn about their magical traditions in the historical record earlier. But when we actually start comparing the archaeology of the two groups, they had similar practices. But as far as how broadly practiced, quote unquote, domestic ritual activity or magic was, it seemed to be broader and more varied in Greece. Like the tradition was, basically it was really, really popular in ancient Greece, and it was just popular in Rome. If you think of like your famous rock star, they're not as popular in Europe, but they're still popular. And the Romans seem to take a pragmatic approach to it. Like, hey, we need to protect ourselves against bad omens. Like, so they were more using magic as a ward and protection, where the Greeks were kind of using it to supplement like everyday life, so to speak. Like, the Greeks had a high tendency to practice magic as a daily activity, where the Romans may have been a little bit less prone to break it out every day. So, not that they didn't. Some Romans obviously did because they wrote about it, but it just, when we look at the literature, it seems that the Romans were saying, hey, use it when you need it. Don't overdo it. Again, that's the conservative side, where the Greeks were like, hey, if you do this every day, things get better, right? Like, so
gotcha.
Different approach.
So everyone would have been some degree of witch then, maybe, or practitioner at least, in Greece?
Well, particularly women. So women, when we say magic, and we talk about activities within the homes, men did it. But in the Greek tradition, it was something that women were expected to learn, were the basic rituals that were responsible for the care and maintenance of the home. So it's not just, it wasn't just like, is she good at cooking and cleaning and having babies? No, it was, hey, does she know the rituals of protection so that she can, make the necessary amulets for my children when they're getting ready to go off to school, so that they don't, they don't get possessed by a daemon of disease, right? So the Greeks embraced this system. So did the Romans, but the Romans, again, were a little more as you need it, right? Not right. And the Romans paid patron to their gods every day, even in their home. But when we talk about magic, this idea of interaction with the divine in a context that's not associated with normal religious practices that were kind of approved within the cultic system, we see that the Romans were more conservative in doing that. Not that it's hard to say because there's a variance across the spectrum, but in the ancient Greece, there were a lot of people that practiced magic, particularly women.
Okay, so I have a question here. I don't know if it's a good question or not, but as you're talking, I'm kind of wondering, we hear a lot about pagans, and we think of paganism as being kind of this witchcraft and magic and that kind of stuff. But are they really? Is there a difference between paganism and witches and witchcraft?
No, in the ancient world, if you would have used the word pagani and for the plural form of, and all pagan in the original word in Latin meant was someone who is kind of rustic, like not a town person. Like we'd say he's a rube or she's a rube today, right? Like, or it was someone who wasn't sophisticated.
Oh.
And so they would say, well, like superstition and magic, that's for the countryside people. That's for the town folk that aren't the city folk, right? The rural folk, right? But even in towns, they practiced it, which is really weird. They kind of projected as it being something that only the country people believed in. But when we look at how cities function, the average person in the city was practicing magic as well, but they were doing it in town, and for some reason, it wasn't something kind of outside the norm. And one of the problems we have in ancient literature is it's usually written by social elites who kind of already kind of are in many cases poo-pooing the idea of magic as just superstition, both in the Greek and Roman world. But depending on the time period, even the Greeks are going, hey, you go out to these villages and they just believe anything, and you can always find some woman or man there saying they have supernatural powers and act as the local witch or wizard, right, or magoi. So this idea that it was every town probably had one or two practitioners of magic, and a village often worked along this kind of matriarchal understanding that, hey, there's always a woman in town who knows a little bit of this. And we're talking even in small villages. And it was often associated with kind of, what do women do? Well, women are responsible for learning a little bit of natural remedies, right? And it's engaging in pharmakia, right? Like this practice of making stuff. So we get the word pharmacy today, right? So the making of drugs. Well, that was often something discussed by women. Men did it too. But when it was done in a nefarious way, we often see it being associated with women. So she poisoned her wife. She gave her husband a love potion. He was enchanted by her. Like weak-willed men in the ancient world, both Greeks and Romans, were often the belief cause of that was predation by women on a supernatural level. If a man was weak-willed, it's not that he was weak-willed. It's his wife had enchanted him or given him a potion or cast a spell that was causing him to be weak-willed. So if you were one of these men that was like enamored with your woman and deferred to her, and weren't a proper stoic Roman man, there would have been something like, hey, maybe she slipped him a potion that causes him to lose his ability to project his power around her. And women were dealing with a lot of issues too. So when we talk about home, and I'll stop earlier, it's also women had a unique role that sometimes is given a real negative look, but contraception was a woman's role in the ancient world. It fell entirely upon women. So, there were a lot of, whether they worked or not, there's a lot of debate on that. But women would use various traditional remedies to prevent both conception and then, when necessary, to abort unwanted pregnancies. And that was
as a negative.
The Romans saw it that way, particularly by the time of the Roman Empire. There become increasing numbers of laws to prevent women from, quote unquote, willy-nilly. Because remember, the men were the responsible agent for procreation, right? So we see increasing from about the first through again, once the Christians get on board, it's going to be verboten entirely. But like even Augustus, the Emperor Augustus, who's seen as this big pagan guy, it discouraged abortion, like formally said, hey, I'm not going to outlaw it, but I'm going to say, if you're a proper Roman, you're not going to do it, right? So there's this increasing removal of that particular power among women, although women kept doing it. So, you could be charged for being the maker of potions that cause abortion, both by pagan emperors and then later, like from Constantine forward, it becomes fully illegal.
So we really have not progressed that much then.
No.
We have another question. D. Murphy asked, so how did you get interested in this subject, and was it taboo in your home growing up? That's a great question.
So my grandmother, if those of you who have seen me on the shows before, my grandmother was Greek, born in Greece, came to the United States. She had some folk beliefs. We call it folk magic today. And she, like, as a very young child, I was introduced to the concept of the mati in Greek, which is the eye. People call it the evil eye, but in Greece, it's not evil per se. And you can use it to like ward off other evil. And you can also use it to kind of project some badness toward people. And so I grew up with that concept as a kid, that there was this bad thing. My grandmother had mati strategically placed all over the house. Sometimes she would draw them in the windows so evil spirits couldn't come through and get the children and grandchildren sick. So I grew up with that tradition in my home. And then later on, as an archaeologist and historian, I was fascinated both in ancient religious systems, but more how was religion engaged? How were people engaged in religion in a domestic context? We kind of try to put everything in big files or big categories. We talk about like the state religion of Rome, like that was the gods and the temples and all of that stuff. And we talk about the smaller community activities like marriage. Marriage was kind of both a personal thing, but also very open to the community because you went out in public, let everyone know you're married, very community-based ritual process in most cases, not all. But I wanted to know about the personal religious practices of ancient peoples like Romans and Greeks. Because I thought, wow, do they believe like we do? Because when I say it's my personal relationship with Jesus, well, the ancient world had personal relationships with their own divinities, and a lot of those fell into this category we'd call magic, right, or domestic ritual activity. So.
Okay, and we have another one. I try to get the questions from the viewers or our producer whenever I can. So Wes asked, did Roman soldiers use a lot of magic, witchcraft, amulets, perhaps? Love to hear some religious thinking in the military, too, if you have comments.
Absolutely. So I kind of love this question because the Romans would go out and as a soldier, you worshipped as the army. You offer, if you knew the battle was coming, you certainly were making offerings to Jupiter Optimus Maximus. If you were a Roman soldier, you were praying to Mars for victory upon the battlefield. But on a personal level, you were making single offers by yourself or with a couple of your buddies to the goddess Fortuna. That's the god of good fortune, the goddess of good fortune. And you're basically saying, dear goddess, grant me protection and let me survive the battle. Basically, like, I don't really fucking care if we win as long as I survive.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, Mars and Jupiter, we want to win and we're going to fight. But if it goes bad, save my ass. So you see this multi-level, even among Roman soldiers, like Romans that fought in a battle and then came back and were victorious, would make small offerings, like dedications to the goddess Fortuna. Thank you for protecting me during the battle. Like giving me the letting me luck and protection were sometimes related as the same concept. So good fortune, right? So we see a multi-level of dedications by Roman soldiers. One at like the group level, like, hey bros, let's go pray to Mars and Jupiter Optimus Maximus so we kick those enemies' asses. Then secretly going, hey Fortuna, hey, remember me if shit goes bad. Like, I know my bros, but I want to make sure I make it off the battlefield alive. So.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Wes, for your question. I find that very fascinating. I really do, because it's like the two sides of a highly masculine military guy. He's like the one side, we're gonna do it. On the other side, please don't let me die. And I think that's in reality, I think that's how everybody is. No matter how macho you may be.
And the Roman religious system, the Roman paganism, right, wasn't that much different than like a lot of religious systems today. There's this, like, when you think of Christianity, most Christians today think of it as themselves. I hate to say it, but I think it has to do with the fact that we're less community orientated. So people go, my personal relationship with whatever divinity they believe in. But in the Roman world, like if you think back to like the medieval period, the church was a state institution. Much like the Roman system back at the time of the emperors, right? So that's the reason we call it the imperial cult, for one reason, is because it was so associated, and that has to do with the emperors as well. But the imperial cult, right? Like how they worshipped as a broad selection of different cultures and people. And then there was community based, like, well, you didn't have to worship Jupiter every day, but in your town, you may have been like a former a Celtic person who's now part of the Roman Empire, right? And you're happy to be there, so to speak. You still worship your native gods and goddesses of the region. You may build a temple to Jupiter in your town to show, we have some deference to Rome and we're not going to dishonor their gods, but we're still going to worship the gods and goddesses that we've traditionally worshiped and engage in personal activity with some of the lesser spirits and my ancestral spirits that still dwell in this area. I used to think about like this. If you're a farmer and you have a stream, in the ancient world, you probably had a shrine set up to your stream that you used to irrigate your fields. Now, no one else in your town is going to come down and venerate your spirit, but you and your family are probably going to do that. Like, hey, let's go offer, it's time to plant and crop. So let's make sure the goddess of the spring is happy, and we'll make some offerings to the larger gods of agriculture. But you're gonna placate multiple levels of divine beings in order to make sure everything goes well. And it used to be very common in the medieval world as well for priests to come out and bless your house and your crops. right? Like we don't see this type of activity today as much, but in, medieval, up until a couple hundred years ago, the systems were way closer than people really want to compare them. A lot of the same type of ritual activity went on both within Christianity and outside of Christianity, or what we call the pagan communities, but I just call it the Roman religious system.
So that ended up changing, though, right? Where people could, like you were saying, if it was a Celtic person who is happy to be in Rome, and so they put up their things to the Roman. I don't remember exactly what you said
Like
they were.
Build a temple to Jupiter
Temple,
Maximus, right? Like honor the Roman gods of the state. And they even build a temple to honor one of the deified emperors. And I mean, depending on how big the town's got, but in a smaller town, right, or big village, they may not have any dedication to the state religion at all, but they'd still be venerating their local deities that they'd had before, quote unquote, the Romans came.
Okay, but that eventually changed with Christianity, right? That you couldn't just do your, venerate your own gods, at least publicly, maybe.
Sort of. That takes a long time to be replaced. So by today's standards, it was hundreds of years before that system of exchange. So one thing we don't talk about a lot, well, I do because I'm a nerd, but we talk about, how did we get the cult of the martyrs in the early Christian church? And I'm talking about it like before we're really Catholic or Orthodox, we have this kind of early Christian church through the 4th, 5th, 6th century. And we look at the archaeology of those first converts to Christianity, and even converts that were generations removed from, it was the grandma who converted. She was the first Christian in the family, right? Mm. So when we look at those families, both Rome and outside of Rome, we see this continual synchronization or retention of earlier beliefs. For example, in many of the Christian burials, and we identify them as Christians based on the iconography of their sarcophagi that they're buried in Rome and other places throughout where the ancient Roman Empire was, cities, towns out in like Romania, Bulgaria, what is today France, but anywhere where the Roman kind of concept of ancestor veneration was going on, even those communities had it before the Romans got there. We see, for example, with the Romans, they were still engaging in cultic activity, honoring and feasting with the dead of their own family. And they had, multiple times a year, these ideas of going out and engaging in festivals of the dead. We'd call it like, imagine if, and I hate to say it, but imagine if Halloween was a concept that you did about 6 times a year, but it was focused on going out, talking to the dead of your family, having a ritual meal with them. You actually we'd see, finding sarcophagi, there'd be little holes, right? You can find these today. If you look at them, I mean, I always poke my fingers in them when I'm in a museum and show people, but there are these little carved funnels for jamming in food, little pizza bread or a little bit of meat and stuff, and pouring wine in order that they participate in the meal. It was like a physical representation. We talk about sympathetic forms of magic. This would be giving them food in order they can be nourished, right? So the Romans were still doing this after their Christianization.
Wow.
What happens is slowly bishops are seeing this as being problematic in the 5th, the 6th century, and they start canceling the practice. And what they say is, in order to venerate the right people, we're exchanging your grandmother for a patron saint, a saint within the church. So these rituals get transformed from being broadly public with your own family, and the focus goes from honoring your family's dead to the church's dead. Make sense?
Yes.
And, we see the cult of the martyrs come out of this earlier tradition as well. And they're seen as bigger than life anyway. So this transition from what families are, and the best thing is if you are a family member who had a martyr in your family or a saint in your family, that gave you prestige among these Christian communities as well. So you in many ways you were motivated to embrace this new ideal because, oh yeah, well, my cousin's actually that martyr, or my great aunt, or whatever. And so we see this slow transition. It wasn't overnight. It took literally a couple centuries for Romans to abandon this earlier practice, even while they were Christians, to adopting a later tradition, which is like the cult of the saints, which is the idea that these saints are holy people that in of themselves have magical powers. I guess people could read if they want. Last year, I wrote a chapter for an edited volume for a journal. It's published through Archeo Press. You can look it up. We'll put it in the show notes. But it's called Made Sacred by the Blood of Martyrs. What I do in this chapter is discuss how the use of martyria, the crypts, were used to sanctify soil. Basically, in the ancient world, early Christians didn't believe something to be holy without something holy that was already acknowledged as being holy being placed in it. So if you didn't have a martyr to bury under a church, it wasn't sacred. Because so many of the sites had to be transitioned from earlier pagan sites and new sites created, that without the addition of some dead holy guy or woman, the ground itself couldn't be sanctified for a new dedicated sacred space in Christianity. Now today, it's just somebody goes out and says this is now they pray, right? Or they and they'll do something like some type of ceremony. They'll say this ground's been consecrated. But in the ancient world, you actually needed the blood of a martyr in order to sanctify the soil, or a piece of them, right? Like when I say blood, it's sometimes it's just later by the Middle Ages. It's like, hey, do you got a finger? We need a finger to put underneath this church. But in the early church, in the 3rd and 4th and 5th century, it was an actual martyr, the body of martyrs. And in the case of Halmiris, where I excavated when I was in Romania, it was the bodies of 2 martyrs. And that was one of the few churches we know was consecrated by Constantine. He ordered its dedication. The martyrs were exhumed from their burial sites, brought in a crypt. A martyrium was constructed over the church, and it became the central focal point of what would the altar area would be today. So the idea that you had to have a holy place with holy people buried underneath it was a very magical belief that was just kind of brought right into Christianity. Like the idea that these men and women were holy, their holiness would diffuse into the surrounding ground. And by that, some magical, I always think of it as like magical seepage and like groundwater seepage, but that it was this ability to allow a space to become sanctified by proximity to these whole dedication with the body of someone who obviously was considered holy in of themselves.
Wow. So you've just kind of blown my mind a little bit, because I'm going to show another question from our viewers, but I thought that when Christianity came in, that it was kind of it was a violent and sudden type of a thing, and it wasn't. It's interesting to know, because I had no clue. That's very, very interesting. And it also helps me to think about, in Europe, there's a lot of the churches with I didn't really understand why there was always martyrs buried underneath in like a, now I understand. That's quite fascinating.
Yeah.
So D. Murphy says, when I think of old Roman times, I do think of a lot of human sacrifice for some reason. Not sure if it's because of things I was taught in church. Did they engage in that much? I was thinking the same thing, which is why I saw her question, and I'm like, okay, we got to go there.
Oh, that's not good. Sorry, I thought I had my phone on vibrate.
That's okay. You're a popular guy.
No, I'm not. It's probably someone calling me. Hey, are you on YouTube right now? No. Honestly, depending on how we categorize it, the answer could be yes and no. Like formal ritualized sacrifice of a human. Not Romans didn't like it. And the Romans, part of the reason the Romans in their own literature give one of the reasons they destroy Carthage was because the Carthaginians practiced human sacrifice. That was one of the things the Romans said, these people are so evil. They practice human sacrifice and the sacrifice of babies. We're going to destroy them. Because the Romans believed that if it did happen, that it only was supposed to happen in very rare circumstances of extreme dire need. And basically, it was generally considered outlawed. So during the time of the empire that we're talking about, there was no human sacrifice. That was associated with the cultic system of the period. Earlier in Romans history, like before the Republic, during the time of kings, we believe there was some forms of human sacrifice. The Romans couldn't turn their back on it entirely. They had to say, yeah, a long time ago we may have done that, but we've become more civilized since then. But the Romans did routinely sacrifice defeated enemies. So if I say, thank you, Jupiter Optimus Maximus, for giving us victory, by the way, Jim, go ahead and stab all of those defeated enemies, like ritually cut their necks, right? Is that sacrifice? I mean, some experts would say no. I think we need to re-examine some of these post-victory executions of people throughout the ancient Mediterranean to say, were these ritualized sacrifice? So to put it back into terms that people understand, like when the armies of Israel are slaughtering the Canaanites after the victory, is that cultic activity associated with honoring the gods, or is that just an army doing what armies do when they're victorious? I think there's a cultural reference to that too. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. Like, hey, the gods would be honored by this activity. Mars was a bloodthirsty god, kind of like Yahweh in some cases. And so defeating an enemy in that way, it was kind of a mixed thing. Yeah, it's just soldiers doing what soldiers do, but at the same time, there were sometimes very controlled ways this happened. You'd captured everybody, they were knelt down, then they're ritually one by one or in small groups slaughtered, right? How that activity occurs and the context of those killings, if they're ritualized, then they start becoming human sacrifice. And if you're doing it in the name of your god, which the Romans did, when the Romans went to battle, they were fighting for Jupiter and they were fighting for Mars. So when they took those excesses on the battlefield, were they sometimes engaging in ritualized behavior? They may have been. So it's hard to say in every context. So, as far as one person standing at the front of a temple having their throat slit, the Romans didn't like that, but the Romans did sometimes ritually murder people, or at least have some ritualized forms of murder in their social and cultural system.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying that, because I was along the same way as Dee was. I thought it was as well. And Wes asks, do you know anything about the oracle, the one which Socrates was said to have visited, telling him that he was the wisest? And was this stuff common? And did the Romans have a lot of that too?
Yeah, there were oracles. Yeah, so there were oracles throughout the entire world. The Oracle of Delphi is maybe the best known oracle in the ancient world. But there was the Oracle of Dodona. There was the Sibyls. There was the in Italy at Cumae, the Sibyl there. So there were oracles throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Now, what most of these oracles had in common, the ones that we know really well, is they were associated with either a cultic site where worship occurred, or they were they were associated with a particular temple cult. So like, it's kind of weird. Like when we talk about Delphi, we have the natural fissures there, where again, there's been a lot of debate about the natural gases that were emitted from there. Don't want to get into all that. No questions. But so they're around that site, which seems to be older than the later temples built. Eventually that site's turned into a Templar site where there's shrines, temples, and a lot of things built to honor the oracle, the god himself, Apollo, because the Oracle of Delphi was believed to got the revelatory ability from the god Apollo. At Dodona, that was an oracle to Zeus. So oracles also were associated with different gods and goddesses. Actually, it's really sad because there was even an oracle to Heracles. Very sad little oracle that we know of because it's talked about in literature, where you basically paid a few coins and threw dice. But that was a formal oracle to Heracles, and you would look up on a chart like what your results were, and you got like a 7 and a 9. All right, your wife's cheating on you. Yes, like you'd ask your question, throw the dice, and get an answer. So there were all different types of oracles too. So some were, through pneuma, through the god inhabiting a person and giving them divine insight, to, more of like using of lots and entrails and things like that. So oracles use different variety of methods, but many are associated with the utterances of sacred things.
Okay. My mind's a little bit blown, so bear with me, because it's like
I can talk about this shit all day. Like, just winding up, let me go. I'm like the Energizer Bunny on this stuff. I love it.
This is really cool. I mean, so I had visited Rome. Let's see, it has been 11, maybe 12 years ago. And so I guess when you look at at some of the ancient ruins there, you immediately think of things like sacrifice. And so, I'm kind of in my head, I'm going, okay, maybe that was later on, when we get into, um, maybe the fourth or fifth century, because you're talking about things, well, I don't know, maybe not. Maybe so, because we've gone to a whole bunch of different times. So my mind's going
Right.
like, okay, we were talking about some of the earlier stuff, like,
Right.
but we've also moved into like the fourth and fifth century as well. So let me just ask you this: when did those type of things? What century were those type of things happening with the sacrifices like that? I mean, they would take the people that they had captured and have them go out, and be killed by animals and that kind of thing.
Well, so the games, kind of a different concept, right? And they were kind of, if you want to say, loosely to say that the games were done in order to honor the gods, sure, but it's a very complicated social spectacle as well. But I guess
Okay.
you could make that connection, and you wouldn't be wrong. But it doesn't ever really end. It changes context. So as far as, like, real quick, going back to, you say, well, I see the temples. Remember that with the sacrifice of animals in the Roman system and the Greek system and the Egyptian system and many of the ancient systems throughout the world, Celts, was a very public thing. So you didn't sacrifice in the temple. You sacrificed at the entrance of the temple. The god or goddess would watch from the temple. You'd open the doors, and then you go outside because it's a big fire, and they knew not to burn fires inside, because A, they fill your temple up with smoke, and B, it catches fire sometimes, and you don't want to burn your temple down. So, and it was believed, though, that it was also to allow the smoke to raise without any stoppage straight to the heavens, where the gods would be pleased with it. There's all this, reasons they did it this way. I'm a practical guy. I say, yeah, well, they also knew that stuff caught on fire. So it was a very public event. Now, by 380, 390, the Emperor Theodosius has ordered the closing of all the temples. So there's no more public sacrifice. It's ended by almost the end of the 4th century. And by that point, Christianity is definitely on rise to be, there's really good books on it, but basically at that point, there's no turning back on the Christian system in the Roman world. But we see stuff still continue. By the way, Romans, even after the Christianization of the Roman army, so to speak, we're still sacrificing, or I shouldn't say sacrifice, we're still killing other people. Like, there were still these, hey, we've captured these people. Are we going to take them as slaves? No. Well, let's just execute them. The worst thing to be was a wounded soldier on the battlefield who could have recovered with some medical care, because the Roman, even the Christian Roman world, wasn't about taking injured prisoners. So, hey, that guy has an ankle injury. You're like, hey, no, dude, I can walk on it. Nah, just, we don't want to be bothered. Cut his throat. Like, that was very common. And often, I don't think it's funny, but I think it's some kind of ironic. Often these were Christian armies fighting each other at various points in the Roman period as well. Like when the later Franks are fighting the Germans, they're both Christians. So it's two quote unquote Christian armies doing this to each other. And once the battle's over, like, okay, we're all friends again in many cases. Mm-hmm. But they were very violent. And then there were also still pagan groups that the Romans were fighting with after their Christianization. And typically these groups still acted as they had acted in many ways before quote unquote Christianization had occurred, as far as how the armies were treating each other.
So you had also brought some, or had a slide.
I did. Well, I can't load them. It said I can only load 2, and then I tried to take one out. So let's see what happens when I do this one. Because they're just going to flip out a couple things real quick, kind of show some people some stuff. It's not letting me. So let's see.
If it does. Yeah, while he's doing that, I just want to thank everyone who has been contributing in the chat. It really means a lot to our channel and to me as well, because I love y'all's questions. Y'all always have great questions and get me thinking. Just my head starts spinning with some of these questions. So I just wanted to thank those that are in the chat now. Like, let's see, we have Theo, we have Dan D, we have D. Murphy, we have, I saw in here a Tsunami. Let's see, Cat, of course, is in here. I saw a few others. I'm just scrolling up. Hollyhock. And a few others. And John Hudson, if I did not call your name, I apologize. I'm just kind of flipping through really quickly. All right, so I see one. I'll go ahead and add it. Do you want me to do the first one? It looks like a cover page. You want to do that one?
No. Just the page that shows. Yeah. Just so people can kind of see a little bit what we're talking about when we look at like kind of the fun part of magic in the ancient worlds is like curses. Now this is a Greek example actually found in Egypt. So understand that at one point in time, the Roman world, Egypt's controlled by Rome. We talk about the Greco-Egyptians, we talk about the Greco-Roman period, but this piece in particular is kind of fascinating to show you how violent this idea of magic could be in the ancient world. Now there's this clay figurine represents a person. It's an image. It's in the ancient world. We wouldn't call it a voodoo doll because that's a different term, but the ancient Greek term for it would be a kolossi. And this one in particular has 13 bronze pins shoved throughout it. And it's in the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the genitalia, and the curse that's associated with it, which was written on that lead, like it looks like a sheet of paper that's actually lead, and they would write the curse, across it, roll that up, put that inside, in this case, that jar. You could put it in other containers, but jars are very common. Put the votive object in there with it, then bury it with a dead person so they could take the message to the underworld so this person would receive a proper curse, right? This is all magic in the ancient world, but this would be magic because this is not something that a priest of the local temple would be saying is a good thing, right? Because it's a one-on-one thing. It's one person to another, which is often how magic works. I'll read it here. So it says, led Ptolemaeus, which is talking about the Wickham, who Aias bore, the daughter of Horigenses, bring to me. Prevent her from eating or drinking until she comes to me, Serapamon, who Aurea bore, and do not allow her to have experience, I mean sex, with another man except me alone. Drag her by her hair, by her guts, until she does not stand aloof from me, and until I hold her obedient from the whole world of my life, loving me, desiring me, and telling me what she is thinking. Now, this is often called love magic. This is actually a curse. Basically, if this woman and this daemon that this guy is summoning can't bring this woman into my affection, then she's to basically wither and die. So love magic by the person throwing it out could be seen as very powerful, but this is a form of curse. But it's also on one side of it seeing as I love this, I want this person so badly, like lustfully, that I'm going to use magic in order to pull them to me. So when you say, is this love magic? I'd say, well, it's definitely domestic violence love magic. But it was also believed that you could take the will away from another person, have them turn towards you. Now, at the same time, if you were saying, let's say you're this young woman who is obviously this person's focus, you'd probably be wearing protective amulets to ward off evils such as this, curses, any magic that would be directed at you. And we have a variety of amulets like you could wear that'd be inscribed with protective wards, like may the light of Apollo protect me, or different. And there are a lot of divinities you could call upon to do this, which is interesting because once this, again, we're talking about the transition to Christianity, this didn't stop either. What we just see is instead of invoking Greek and Roman gods, we just see early Christians changing the name to Jesus, and it was the intaglio. These are what we call the little amulets. Basically, they start writing different verses of scripture or short prayers, and they believe they were magical amulets, and they were doing the same function, just with different, quote unquote, a different god or goddess associated with it.
So, Kat has a question, but before I bring it up, I wanted to ask you a question. With this guy doing this pretty creepy curse, but her having amulets, you had said earlier that women were often the the focus of negative results whenever things would go wrong. So if she did not fall madly in love with him, was there anything that would happen to her? Like, would he then tell people she was using some type of magic against me or something like that, where she would end up having an,
That's a
I don't
good
know,
question.
being,
No. So that's a really good question. So first of all, let's just say it's Pat and I'm after Sunny. If I was after you and in my quote unquote love demon didn't work, right? First of all, I'd have to admit that I did it. And people go, well, you're a fucking asshole. Did you summon a daemon in order to take Sunny's free will away from her? And it would be considered really bad form. It's basically admitting to like you're like a potential felon. You committed a felony, but you're telling us out loud. So there was a social anxiety of just not admitting you did it. Now I may try it again, but then I might become convinced that, man, she's wearing some really powerful protective amulet, right? So it's this kind of like there was always an excuse and you know, as far as psychology is concerned, there was a cognitive dissonance engagement with this as well. You believed in it, but there was a reason it didn't work, and the reason was because Sunny is protected, and she'd gone to the old wise woman and gotten that amulet. So you know there was always a reason you could justify the ineffectiveness of it. But if it did work, you told everybody knew, because they'd be like, you know, Sunny hated Pat. Then all of a sudden, next thing we know, like a week later, they're getting married. Now, you and I both know weird shit happens in life, but people would say, well, you know, he did use a daemon. Well, that explains it.
Wow. Okay. So Kat's question is, do they know how far back using voodoo type sculptures were used?
Well, so it depends on what we know the Greeks definitely used it. We know the Mesopotamians used it. So all the way, like if Dr. Josh came on, he'd be telling you about all the prayers because despite what people believe, Dr. Josh did his PhD on ancient writings involving prayers and stuff, which some of these emulate in identical ways. So ancient Mesopotamians were doing this as well. We see it in Egypt, all the way back to even the pre-dynastic period. The idea of using votive representations is an important part of representative magic in magical tradition. Like I have something that looks like you or represents you, so that way we can engage each other magically. And so it goes back as far in the archaeological record as often as we can find with a cultural group, even like, so it happened quote unquote before the pyramids in Egypt. And we do see some stuff coming out of the Neolithic that gives us suggestions that either these are votive objects being offered, or possibly they could have been used in a variety of magical traditions. And sometimes it's hard to tell, is this being dedicated to a god or goddess on behalf of a small community, or is this a one-on-one dedicatory offering where we kind of maybe start looking at possibly magic? But as far as representing, voodoo would be a representative magical system using, that's part of the magical construct and the efficacy people would see. It goes back quite a way, at least into the Neolithic and probably before into the Mesolithic.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Kat. And then Hollyhock has a question. Did people use this type of magic invoking saints?
Yes. So they believed that saints were protective divinities. So if you grew up in a Catholic system, you still get a little bit of this, where people have patron saints, right? And you wear a medal to St. Michael. Well, that's not Jesus. But what's St. Michael going to do? He's going to be on your fucking side if shit goes sideways. No different than Fortuna back in the day. So they're going to say it's not magic. And when you ask them why it's not magic, they're going to say because it's Christianity.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're not going to be able to, the difference between invoking Apollo and it becoming magic and invoking, you know, Jesus and it not being magic is a cultural reference point. And as someone who, I mean, I don't like to call myself an anthropologist, but archaeology is a subdiscipline of anthropology. From my, you know, academic and professional perspective, there's no difference. They're all invoking very similar or identical archetypes. And so there's really no difference, except you don't want there to be a similarity, so you deny it.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. Again, thank you guys all for, so far we don't have any other questions from the group, from the chat. So I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for those questions.
Well, I do. Oh, just 1 second, because I know we have to go because we're scheduled for an hour. But I put up another slide. Can you put up that little slide with the little oil lamp on it?
I sure can. Absolutely. There we go.
So one of the things we didn't get to cover, but why is there so much magic and it's hard to tell in the archaeological record? Because guess what? Magic uses a lot of stuff from the home. So this pictured here is a very typical oil lamp in the ancient world. Nothing special about it. It's actually one of the kind of lower end ones. But like personal divination, people believed, like, remember God Apollo is the sun god. He's one of the big divinities that have to do with divination and foretelling the future. So if you could get divination, there was all kinds of lamp divination in the ancient world. Today people call it candle magic, but that's really not fair. But you could believe that by praying and having ritual activity associated with even the open flame of a lamp, you could receive divinatory power. And so there were ritual practices of recited prayers or mantras, so to speak, that could be offered while you sat in a dark room looking at a candlelight, working yourself into this altered mental state and then seeking divination in the flames. And so there were all these ideas, and that we'd call that magic today, but it was just seen as like your home divination kit, right? Like, everybody's got a lamp. Get your good lamp. Use you typically use the best one you have, but use the best lamp you have in the home. And the reason we know this happened is because often there were prayers scratched on the bottom of them. Even during the Christian, you talk about magic during the Christian period, we see some change, but like, it used to be like, may the light take away the darkness in the pre-Christian period, or may Apollo protect me in the darkness. And all that happens is it becomes, may the light of Jesus protect me. May the light of Christ protect me. So very similar object belief relationship. Just, well, we don't believe in the old Apollo stuff, but we believe in the new Jesus stuff. So that makes this special. But early Christians would carry around lamps at night that are lit when they went out in the darkness, to light their way, but also believing that light was in a way manifesting the light of Christ in order to keep away baleful spirits and bad energies and things like that. So again, it's all basically how you want to reference it. So it sometimes makes it hard. My point is, sometimes it's hard to identify, was just a regular lamp in a house, or was this part of someone's, magical tradition? The answer is often yes to both questions.
That is so cool, because I immediately started thinking, first of all, a song when I was growing up, This Little Light of Mine, and we would have candles and we would usually sing that because you'd be like, you're going to let the light shine. And then the other thing was the luminarios were a very important part of the Christmas tradition in New Mexico, where I spent a lot of my time as a young child. That's where my family was from. And we would have, little sacks with sand in them and a candle, and that was our Christmas lights there. It was a very, I think it's a very Catholic thing, actually, but we were not Catholics. But as you're talking, I'm seeing my childhood and that stuff in my head. It's so similar to that. And you don't think of it in that way. You're right. It's like, we were Christians, and so of course we're not dealing in that kind of stuff. That's for the pagans. It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing.
Well, and so if you're familiar with Apuleius and the golden ass, right? Like that story, there's part of that story where there's this woman who's a witch, by the way, and she lights a lamp in order to tell the future, right? And if you're familiar with the story, she prays, she looks in the lamp, but the explanation is that's a little piece of Apollo, of the photos, of the god of light, and that she's bringing that, by that little flame being a little piece, she's able to use that to reach the greater divinity, to receive divination, or revelation, whatever you want to call it. Divination, revelation are sometimes international terms, but don't tell Christians that. And so that story there makes a lot of sense, right? Like, oh, okay, she believes that there's a little part of the whole. That little story that you did with This Little Light Is Mine, right? Many Christians believe that little light was part of the light of Jesus. And I think people even today would believe, like, as they're sitting there holding it, like, this light, this is the light of Christ. Maybe it's not the actual light, but it represents that light. right? So it's a representative form of magic, but they're not going to call it magic. They're going to call it devotional activity, ritual activity, ceremonial. They'll come up with all these other words for it, but they're believing in one way or another that this is either something we do to show we believe God is the light, Jesus is the light of the world, or maybe he, this is a little bit of him right here with us.
Yep.
Not too different than the pagan concept.
Well, what a great way to end our show, because that was that just made me smile. And I wish that we would go on, because this is such a fascinating topic. Maybe you'll come on again and talk more about this topic or some of the other topics that you would like.
Have me back for Halloween, and we'll do a whole thing on talking to the dead in the ancient world.
Fantastic. You got it. I'm going to actually hold you to it. I'm going to put you on my calendar then.
Yeah, if you do a show near or on Halloween, I will come back, because I think how the ancients, both early Christians and during the Greco-Roman period, contacted the dead is fascinating. They were much more like, it was involved blood magic, which makes it awesome. But they also believed, there was quite an important component that the dead needed to kind of suck off the living. Like, that's why they offered blood, because the vitality associated with it and stuff. And you could have the dead visit you in other ways through dreams and things. But when you talk about talking to the dead in the ancient world, it's a fascinating subject. And it varied.
Wow.
Like the Egyptians during the Roman period had a slightly different take on it. We have entire books. Holy shit. Like I can't pull it out because my green screen will fall. But like we have these books written that were all these collections of magical papyri, basically magical spells of the ancient world, that were written in both Greek and Demotic and these different languages, where they say, like, they're putting all this down, exactly how you put the formula together, what gods and goddesses you invoke in order to be able to contact and speak with the dead. It's fascinating.
Wow. And now I have all kinds of other questions. I like our show could go on, because now you're got me thinking about a whole bunch of other things. So we're definitely going to have you back on.
Yeah, we'll come back.
Thank you so much for taking your time out on this Thursday to talk with us about this stuff. This is very fascinating, and I really appreciate it. It's fantastic.
Well, one of the things I'd recommend is a good starter book for anybody that's interested. It's Philip Maitzak wrote a very short, very funny. Now, if you know anything about this gentleman, he's an absolutely great historian, but he's pithy. So he kind of pokes fun at the subject when he's talking about it. He wrote a book like Living in the Roman World on a Denarii a Day, like these very, very short, but he wrote a book. This is one of his better known books, Philip Maitzak's Ancient Magic, right? It's a practitioner's guide to the supernatural in Greece and Rome. And he talks about some questions like, what happened when it didn't work? Well, obviously it was your fault. What happened when it worked? Well, the gods can be relied upon, right? So he writes this. This is a really good. And this fall, I'm teaching a course on the history of witchcraft and magic at Peninsula College. If anybody's interested, you can contact me. I'll put my information in the show notes. And we're going to be using the text for the course is, well, you can't see it, Owen Davies, the Oxford Illustrated History of Witchcraft and Magic. And that's the course text. We'll be working through that. So if you're interested in taking the class either online or in person, let me know, and we'll work it out.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And if you like this type of content as much as I do, because it always gets me kind of giddy and I have kind of a nerd rush, please think about supporting our channel. You can do that just by hitting the like, subscribe, bell, all of those kind of things. But you can also, if you would like to, you can think about being a patron. Our patrons right now are Paul Cammish, Helen Green, Logan Fisher, Amanda McLeod, Eric Ozols, Rion, Deneen Murphy, Dan D, Michael Wiseman, me, and Aaron Coalson. Oh, and I almost forgot Phil Calderone. I kept forgetting about Phil Calderone. Thank you guys. You guys are keeping the lights on for all of us. We really do appreciate it. We also have other shows on here. We have our new Monday show, The Black Free Thinkers. They are fantastic. If you have not checked that out, you need to. Come back here on Thursdays for the Sunny Spot. Saturday, we have both the Global Atheist and Women Atheist Unload. That's a fantastic channel there. And then Let's Talk on Sunday. And that's where you can call in and talk to us or our guest. That's a lot of fun. Coming up soon, we're going to have on the Women Atheist Unload, we're going to be talking about Project 2025, which is very important right now. So be sure and check that out. And in the meantime, remember, always think critically. Good night, everybody.
If our being knows this is where we came from, we long to return. And we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along.